Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay Kaye, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Egregor Awakens, taking a tour of a threat actor's new digs. So a bit about me, just as was mentioned, I'm by trade a malware analyst and reverse engineer, and I particularly really like taking apart weird cryptography during my analysis. So I'll talk a little bit about that in this talk. And currently I run INSIT Group's technical team at Record Future. INSIT Group is the threat intelligence team for the company. So today we're going to start with some background on Egregor, then we're going to do a technical deep dive, talk about some technical overlaps with other threat actors, and then finally finish up with ways to track Egregor. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Egregor, they began operating in September 2020, and they're considered a variant of the SecMet family. So around the same time in September 2020, Maze, another ransomware family, stopped encrypting new victims. So at the time that Maze went down, Egregor started coming up. And it's suspected that many affiliates of the Maze ransomware variant have likely moved to the Egregor ransomware as a service group. Like many big game ransomware hunting groups, they do the name and shame of victims on their extortion site, Egregor News. And you can see an example of one of these name and shame instances on Egregor News in the image on the right. So in mid-February, members of the Egregor ransomware as a service were actually arrested in the Ukraine. And at the time, so since about 2/12/21, we saw their infrastructure, so their C2s and that leak site have been down. So since then, they've stopped encrypting new victims, and they don't appear to have rebuilt their infrastructure, suggesting that they are no longer active. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what ransomware as a service is, I'll give you a brief explanation. So the concept of ransomware service starts with a ransomware developer who creates ransomware code. So this individual is technical enough to write the code, create it, package it up, and then make it something that could, actually be effective on a victim system. And then another group of individuals called affiliates can either buy or release this malware to execute their own attacks. So these individuals really don't have to be technical or capable of writing their own ransomware, but they have to have some sort of appetite and desire to conduct ransomware attacks themselves. So the developer, if these affiliates are successful in getting a ransom from an organization, will usually get some cut of that ransom. So that's how the business model works. And because Egregor uses that ransomware as a service model, you'll notice, and we'll talk a little bit about this, the TTPs observed in the attacks will vary. So all these different affiliates will bring different techniques around initial access, so how they initially get on the victim system, some of the pre-encryption things that they'll use. So for lateral movement, so it's how do they move around the victim's network, get to other parts of it. Really they want to create maximum impact. So making sure you encrypt as much as possible is key. Reconnaissance, so collecting information about the victim, the organization, other information that might be valuable to them in, again, increasing the impact of their attack. And then doing some sort of credential stealing, so enabling further access or more extensive access. But really, this can extend to tools used in any stage of the attack. So sometimes you'll see between the initial access and the dropping of the ransomware, additional tools will be dropped based on the desire of the affiliate, the needs of the attack, what the organization's security looks like, and really what they're trying to accomplish. So it's also worth noting that some affiliates either may be or have been involved with other ransomware groups. So they might not just be working for this one ransomware as a service group, but they might be working for others as well. And it's key to know that while some ransomware as a service groups are free for whoever to join, if they'd like, some are very exclusive and invite only. So to give you an idea of exactly how prolific Egregor was while it was active, by the end of 2020, they had claimed 206 victims. So this included many large, well-known organizations that I'm sure you've heard of. And to give you an idea of kind of how this distributed, if you look at this graph of ransomware attacks by family, so through November 2020, you'll see that Maze represents about 26% of the attacks. But keep in mind, at this time, Maze had been active for the better part of about 9 months. And if you look at Egregor, at this point, they'd only been active for about 2 and represented about 13%. So they kind of spun up very quickly and then really got to their whole encrypting and victimizing organizations. So in order to understand how Egregor ransomware attacks unfold and the tools that they use, I've divided the attack into 4 kind of main stages. So initial access, like we talked about, so how the threat actor gains access to the organizational system. Then lateral movement and reconnaissance. So this is that kind of dwell time. So dwell time could last anywhere between, a couple hours or up to, days or weeks. So it really does vary based on the affiliate involved and different groups and really what their needs are. So I wasn't able to find any statistics on the average dwell time for an Egregor attack, but I would suggest that it might not be very meaningful given the fact that there's so many different affiliates involved, and it very likely depends which affiliate is doing what and what the needs of their attack are. So moving on to data exfiltration, because as you can imagine, extortion is more effective when you have something to extort the organization with. So this will be where the threat actor will exfiltrate this victim's data so that they can post on their leak site and then attempt to use it to have the threat actor or have the organization provide them with money so that they take down and don't leak it. And then finally, the dropping of the ransomware, which I'm sure is the kind of most familiar part to all of us of a ransomware attack, and obviously the one that kind of creates the most notice because now your victim system is suddenly encrypted. So to look at some of the tools that are used by in association with Egregor attacks at each stage, let's start with initial access. So here, what we observed is that primarily 3 fairly common techniques used among, phishing is used among APTs as well as a lot of other big game ransomware hunting as well. Really, everybody does use phishing. And then RDP exploits and VPN exploits. So we've seen those different kinds of techniques used with many other big game ransomware hunting. So really nothing super Egregor specific or distinctive there. But again, these are effective and fairly popular among threat actors. Moving into the lateral movement and reconnaissance stage, I'm sure you see a bunch of tools that you're super familiar with. So Cobalt Strike, right? Everybody uses Cobalt Strike. That's a little bit facetious, but many actors within the APT space, as well as big game ransomware hunting, it is an openly available tool that you can purchase on the internet. Similar to kind of the idea of QuakeBot or Sniff and Iced ID, popular banking Trojans that we see used, and AdFind an advanced IP scanner. So again, we're not really seeing anything highly specific or distinctive to the actual Egregor ransomware family, but really just kind of a lot of commodity, openly available, popular, malicious behavior type tools here to enable this stage of the attack. And then moving into data exfiltration, you're probably familiar with Rclone and 7-Zip for their benign use cases, and this is probably where you start to get pause. So arguably the extortion part of the attack is one of the most impactful for an organization because this is the hardest thing to really mitigate, right? So you may be able to kind of detect tools in the lateral movement stage and have anti-ransomware and anti-phishing protections kind of present, but the exfiltration of the data and the extortion is something that is incredibly impactful and also, as you can see, somewhat hard to detect. So having to decide whether the presence of 7-Zip on a system is being used for malicious or benign purposes is fairly complex, and we'll talk more about that later. And then finally, the dropping of the malware, which is really where we see that first Egregor-specific tool that is dropped. So Egregor ransomware, which we'll dive into. And I thought this was fairly interesting. So in one of their attacks, Egregor actually print bombed their ransom note to all the printers of that organization. And so you can see here a picture of a receipt printer at the organization printing out copies of their ransom note, which I thought was particularly interesting and kind of snarky. So looking at the Egregor ransomware payload, there's really 3 layers to this payload malware. So first, the stage 1 packer, I saw obfuscated and unobfuscated versions, a stage 2 packer, and the Egregor payload itself. So in order to successfully execute this payload, you need to provide the correct cryptographic key at runtime. So no key, no execution. And the payload accepts several different command line arguments to determine its functionality and behavior. We'll talk a little bit about that soon. So starting with that stage 1 packer, as I mentioned, I saw 2 different versions, so an obfuscated and an unobfuscated version. And to the right, you can see the unobfuscated version, mostly just because it's a lot easier to see kind of what's going on there and really talk about its functionality. So to me, this suggests it's probably some sort of compile time obfuscation utility because the obfuscated and unobfuscated ones were semantically so similar. So it's probably not something that the threat actor wrote completely different code to accomplish, but probably a compile time, it post-processed and made it look obfuscated. So let's talk about this. So you can see the baked in cryptographic key material. So it uses a cha-cha cipher. So as you can see, the key expand and key nonce add, that is the cryptographic key material. So because the key material is provided, there's really nothing that will prevent the execution of this stage and the unpacking and decryption of the next stage. So really what it's doing is functioning to obfuscate what is contained within this binary. So fairly common for packers to do. Overall, all of them were very similar with some very slight differences. So first, the command line parameter that was passed. So here it's -- no operation. Saw a whole variety of others, not really super meaningful to the functionality of the stage 1 packer. The XOR value that was used in the base64 decode and XOR function to kind of decode that base64 key. Generally, I saw 3 or 4 used as the XOR key, but it can vary. And then finally, the crypto key and initialization vector that were used in those key functions. Again, not really impactful because ultimately all the key material is provided, so we're off to the races. So another interesting thing about the stage 1 packer is that some of them actually had baked in PDB paths that were really fairly similar to each other. So I saw a lot of things that started with M, EWDK, and M/SC/P. And if you look at the big chart on the right, it's the approximate count of how many instances of each PDB path I saw in the collection of samples I had. So this could suggest that there are multiple individuals that are compiling the code, with some of them being more active than others, but this also could just be kind of the distribution of samples that I was able to acquire. But ultimately, PDB is fairly easy to modify per build. So while these patterns are super interesting, noting that it's not necessarily deterministic of, if this PDB path is the same between 2 samples, it's absolutely the same individual, but it is worth noting. So sometimes you'll see other threat actors, Maze in particular, will use the PDB path to make snarky comments or, rude jokes against other security researchers. So I just wanted to highlight this for our discussion. So moving on to that stage 2 packer. So here's where things start to get interesting. So pretty much how this works is there's a function that first reads the command line and is looking for that password that we talked about after the -p. So it has to be passed at runtime. And this password is then passed to a rabbit decryption function. So if you're not familiar with the rabbit decryption cipher, you're not alone. This is fairly uncommon to see used in ransomware. And generally I'll see crypto algorithms like RC4, DES, triple DES, AES. So rabbit was fairly uncommon to be observed here, but that's what they use. And after the decryption takes place, the next function looks for an MZ header. So whether or not it has decrypted a valid PE file, so has successfully decrypted the actual ransomware payload, and if it does, it runs it. So here, as you can imagine, if you do not pass the correct cryptographic key, you will not successfully decrypt it, and then it will be game over. So for samples that you do not have the right cryptographic key for, this is where they stop executing and no ransomware is deployed and nothing else takes place. So if you actually succeed in decrypting the Egregor payload, this is what you get. Fairly typical ransomware behaviors. Doesn't really stick out as particularly novel in terms of what it does. So it'll do the language checks for the Commonwealth of Independent States countries. So fairly common to be doing. And if it finds that the computer is associated with one of those languages, it will stop executing. It will delete the shadow copies using WMI. This is also another pretty common thing to do to really make recovery more difficult for the victim, stopping processes and services that, again, aid in recovery or backup of the system. And then finally, because it is ransomware, it does encrypt the files on the system, except for specific file extensions and folders, predominantly that would enable the computer to function. So executables, DLLs, things like that, because as you can imagine, if you encrypt all of those and the computer no longer functions, even if the person does pay the ransom, then it's going to be very hard to decrypt their stuff because the computer no longer functions. So you can see an example of what the ransom note looks like that is dropped. So we saw an example of that being printed on a receipt printer, but here's a slightly bigger example for you to look at here. So as I mentioned, Egregor and SecMet are fairly related, and it borrows very heavily from the SecMet code. So they have very similar processes terminated, like I talked about, to make recovery more difficult for the victim. The extensions and file names that they avoid encrypting, again, like I talked about. The name of the ransom note file itself, they both use recover-files.txt. the way that they rename encrypted files. So they append an extension to the end of the file to show it's encrypted and the victim notices something is wrong. The string encryption method as well. Like I said, I love talking about weird encryption. So you can see the pseudocode for the string encryption on the bottom right that I put together. So this is a fairly simple, I would say, XOR cipher. XOR-based type ciphers are fairly common as in, obfuscation mechanisms used by different ransomware groups and other APTs. But this is not a specific one that I had seen before, and they are absolutely identical between Egregor and Sekhmet, suggesting that there is some sort of relation, though anybody could really probably incorporate this into their ransomware themselves if they felt like it, or other pieces of code. But this is exactly how they do the string decryption. I thought it was cool. Additionally, the method of code obfuscation that is used. So Egregor is not a very straightforward payload, and they obfuscate the code, specifically the control flow. So if you look at the top two images on the slide, that gives you some idea of some of the techniques that they use. And try to remember this for our next slide, or shortly. So the jump if zero and jump if not zero, fairly common, makes it harder for a reverse engineer to understand the control flow, and does do some to confuse the tools that we use. Finally, they had a highly similar first stage packer. So remember that packer we talked about with the baked in key material that uses the cha-cha cipher. I saw very similar first stage packers used in both. So there are a few key differences between Egregor and Sekhmet though. So the first one is that Egregor does contain code for an HTTP post network request, but it doesn't appear to be triggered at any point. In Sekhmet, this code is used and actually does the post, but it's worth noting because maybe this is kind of vestigial code that has been left over that the developers did not take out, worth noting. And also Sekhmet only has 2 stages. So remember, Egregor has 3 and does not require a password. So Sekhmet has that first stage packer that we said was very similar, and the Sekhmet ransomware. But what it's missing is that middle stage with the rapid decryption that takes in the password and tries to decrypt the payload. So again, no password is required. And if you double click on some Sekhmet, you will in fact get ransomed. So Egregor requires the password, Sekhmet does not. Additionally, Egregor adds a couple different command line parameters. So -- samba. So that means link files will not have a delete on close attribute, and -- kill RDP, which is self-explanatory. Finally, the file names of the dropped files as part of the ransomware attack differ. So Egregor uses dtb.dat and Sekhmet uses sysconfig.db. So I hear a lot of people talk about similarities between Maze and Egregor, and we kind of alluded to that in the beginning. But I wanted to highlight a couple of the differences that I saw at the technical level in the code itself. So first, they use substantially different obfuscation techniques. So for example, Maze does import obfuscation. So it makes it harder to tell which functions are imported to be used in the binary using this import hashing technique that I show at the top right in that image. Egregor doesn't do any sort of import hashing. So there's kind of one key difference. And Maze doesn't appear to obfuscate their strings in any way, while Egregor does. So kind of 2 key different approaches to obfuscation worth highlighting as well. Additionally, the packers and first stages are very different. So like I mentioned, there is a fairly consistent group of like that one first stage packer used with Egregor, but there's a huge variety used with Maze. So Maze also has an affiliate program, and this is likely an artifact of that. So different affiliates will join the program and likely bring tools, techniques, different sort of capabilities with them from previous gigs, or just because that's what they have. So either things they write themselves to pack it, or packers that are commodity that they purchase or acquire in some way. So that's probably the reason for so much variety with Maze versus that one that we really saw with Egregor. And then there were different code obfuscation techniques. So as we saw with the Egregor, they did one kind of code obfuscation. Maze's code obfuscation was, I would say, significantly more extensive, and there are many different techniques used. So I'm not going to go into these in a lot of detail, but you can see them in the 2 images on the right. So some researchers have done a really great breakdown of these techniques and really explain kind of what is going on here. So that's definitely worth checking out if you want. But there was a pretty similar looking country check. So we talked about the Commonwealth of Independent States country check. And you can see in the bottom left, the Egregor country language check and Maze language check look very familiar. So I wouldn't consider this a smoking gun, but in order to do this discussion justice, I am pointing it out. So yes, Lindsay, that is just code. What else? Yes, the diamond model does not go away. So we can't just look at things from the technical perspective here. And we have to think about these ransomware attacks in relation to the victims, the adversaries, and infrastructure that is involved. And let's talk about why that is. So ransomware affiliates are moving to new variants. Operations are spinning up and spinning down over the course of the year. We talked a lot about the commodity tools that have been used. And so this really starts to blur from a technical perspective the obvious hallmarks of specific threat actors or variants. So here's kind of why that is. So as Chainalysis points out, they believe that the blockchain analysis, so a lot of the cryptocurrency things that are involved, suggests that there's affiliate overlap and other possible connections between Maze, Egregor, Suncrypt, and Doppelpaymer. So four, I guess, very well-known ransomware groups. Cobalt Strike, which we had talked about, was actually used in 70% of the big game hunting incidents in 2020. So you remember that large pie chart of all the different threat actors that were using or doing ransomware attacks in 2020. 70% of the big game ones actually used this one tool. So it's not a very distinctive indicator of any one group in particular, just kind of bad behavior. RDP is the most common attack vector employed to install ransomware, which Egregor used. And then VPN vulnerabilities really aren't far behind. And then, like I said before, everyone uses phishing. So really what we're looking at from the technical perspective is a lot of hallmarks of threat actors and malware at a broad technical level, but we're really not seeing anything very ransomware family specific until we get to that actual malware. So that's why context remains super important. So what does this mean for us as defenders? So there is some good news because many of these same TTPs are used between ransomware threat actors. So this really helps us focus our detections and mitigations on some of these common issues and common tools. So different vulnerabilities, different vulnerable products, really being aware of what these are so that we can start to protect them. In its advisory on Egregor ransomware, FBI advised patching several RDP vulnerabilities from 2019 and 2020. And, while these were in association with Egregor, there's, no reason that maybe other threat actors aren't using them now, which they might be, and may not use them in the future. So potentially, even though Egregor doesn't seem to be very active anymore, by protecting against these vulnerabilities, we may be heading off some other avenues that other big game hunting ransomware threat actors will be using. But there's also bad news. So they're still using these TTPs because they're succeeding with them. Phishing will always be a problem. While you have people, they will click on things. And the lures are only getting more creative, more stealthy, and more interesting to potential victims. So additionally, as we all know, patching takes resources and may fall by the wayside as your resources are, handling whatever is kind of top of mind or super critical right now. And you may not even be able to patch all of the potential vulnerabilities that exist for all the ransomware threats and other kinds of threats that you're afraid of. And then finally, separating the good versus bad use of tools is difficult. So we talked about the presence of 7-zip being used for data exfiltration. So for an organization to decide whether the presence of 7-zip on their system is good or bad, it's doable, it's not insurmountable, but it is very difficult, especially given the size of many organizations and the diversity of tools, and the difficulty to truly baseline and understand what a malicious use of 7-zip really looks like and detect it and then thwart it. And the worst news of all is that if they need to, they will evolve their TTPs. So as I'm sure you're aware, there's big money in big game hunting. And while it is still profitable, people will still do it. And remember those affiliates, they're moving between programs, they're learning new skills, bringing new tools. So while you may be aware of what they're using now, keep in mind that as new affiliates join and move around, these techniques will evolve over time, and then we'll start to see kind of a lot more diversity associated with any specific type of threat actor. So if you're interested in tracking Egregor, there's kind of a couple approaches we could take. So first, monitoring for unexpected commodity and openly available tools like they use. So specifically QuakeBot and Cobalt Strike. So again, these aren't Egregor specific, but they are commonly used with ransomware deployments, as I've mentioned. And generally, they're a precursor to many kinds of unsavory behavior. So again, kind of more bang for your buck detecting those. And Recorded Future has actually created SIMA rules and YARA rules for some of these tools. But if you want to track Egregor specifically, a couple things that you can look at. So that second stage with the rapid decryption is actually extremely consistent between the samples. So even at the byte level, the string decryption technique using the final payload that used between both Egregor and SecMet was a fairly consistent kind of indicator of Egregor. As I mentioned, I hadn't really seen it anywhere else. And then finally, that first stage decryption process with the XOR, cha-cha cipher, check for the valid PE file, and then sleep if fail was also something that could be tracked in association with Egregor itself. So what's next? Where are we? So now that the affiliates have been arrested, Egregor operation's pretty likely dead. It's pretty likely that the operators themselves will move to a new operation. And it is possible to see some of the TTPs used. So again, those commodity tools, but maybe also aspects of the actual code itself or different techniques that they developed that they found particularly successful can carry over to their new operation. Also worth noting, ransomware isn't going away anytime soon. So like I said, big game hunting is big business, and while it is profitable, they will keep doing it. Name and shame has proven fairly profitable and successful for threat actors, and it will likely remain popular. And then cartels, in which threat actors team up and then share different resources, so things like leak site and infrastructure, will also probably remain popular as well as we move forward. So with that, thank you so much. I'm Lindsay Kaye. Thank you for attending my talk. Does anybody have any questions?
We actually do, Lindsay. Thanks very much for the talk, first of all. We have a couple of minutes for questions. So we have a question here. How common is the CIS exclusion across different ransomwares?
The CIS exclusion. So generally, it will be in any sort of ransomware that is created by threat actors who are very likely in Eastern European countries, where executing this kind of attack on on computers that are in that kind of group of countries would be very, very bad. You'll see a lot of that there. So like I said, Maze does it. I believe a couple other of the big game hunting ransomware families do it. I saw a sample the other day of, I believe it was DeerCry, that doesn't. So I would say that a lot of the more famous names of ransomware that are created in probably Eastern Europe are more likely to have it versus not. And those are a lot of like the really sophisticated ones that we hear a lot about.
Brilliant, thank you. One more thing. So Egregor is pretty much dead, as you said. It's on its way out, but those criminals are going to move on to new operations, potentially use the same TTP. So what would be your advice on mitigating or protecting against the threat of Egregor or the next thing that comes after Egregor using the same TTPs?
Sure. So like I said, there are a couple ways of getting sort of more bang for your buck for detection. So the best time to detect a ransomware attack is as early as possible. So at that phishing stage, but really looking at that kind of dwell time stage. So the use of things like Cobalt Strike, a lot of the really popular banking bots and Trojans, as I mentioned, frequently used. So as I mentioned, those are generally precursors to all kinds of unsavory behavior. So really kind of understanding what are those common TTPs among the big game threat actors. So you'll see a lot of malicious use of those tools, but then you'll also see malicious use of a lot of living off the land type techniques. So Windows tools themselves. So really trying to understand like what are the tools and techniques that a lot of threat actors use because they remain successful, and then looking to protect against and mitigate those, and then also monitor for their use.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of this talk. Lindsay, thank you very much. The feedback on the chat is great. People love the talk. So thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you so much.